I call the Space Code Foundation video series to order. Welcome. My name is Laetitia Zarkan, and I'm the Director of Programming for the Space Code Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for the second edition of our video series program titled Reducing Space Threats Through Norms, Rules, and Principles of Responsible Behavior. The Space Code Foundation is a 501c3 educational nonprofit corporation that promotes and supports space law and policy education and the rule of law. The Space Code Foundation produces educational materials and scholarship through the administration of several major projects, which includes Stellar Decisis, which will be premiered on July 20th, our research program under the Space Code Law Library, and our new series called the Space Bar Show. The Foundation also engages in partnerships and collaborations that help grow greater awareness of space law and how disputes in space may be resolved as humans venture further from Earth in the not too distant future. For more information about our mission, programming, and internship program, we ask you to visit our website at spacecodefoundation.org. We also wish to thank the Open Lunar Foundation for sponsoring our video series for all of 2021. For more information about the Open Lunar Foundation, please visit their website at openlunar.org. We appreciate the strong support of the space community and invite you to follow us on social media for the latest information. You can find archived versions of all of our program on YouTube. Just search for the Space Code Foundation channel. If you enjoy our programming, please remember to take today's video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your continued support helps us to keep providing you contemporary and innovative programming. Please consider supporting us through Patreon and our merchandise store, Celestial Objections Apparel, on teespring.com. All proceeds go to the Foundation to cover the cost of our programming and support our intern projects. Before we begin, I would like to thank Ambassador Liddle for returning to discuss this important topic. I am also excited to welcome our moderators, Victoria Samson and Daniel Porras, and all our panelists for joining us today, and look forward to an amazing conversation about the legal and policy issues regarding responsible behavior in space activities. I now turn over the program to our moderator, Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you, Letitia. Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. I'm delighted to be here, invited by the Space Court Foundation to be part of this discussion. I think it's a really important conversation to be having, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our broad international spectrum of panelists to hear about the various ideas and thoughts about responsible space behavior. But just to set the scene a little bit about why this is important, I think everyone watching this understands that the space domain is changing. We're seeing an increasingly complicated picture. We have new actors and new uses of space getting out ahead of space governance, and even getting out ahead of standard operating behavior. Even though we've been in space for multiple decades now, there are new things happening, and governance has not been able to keep up with it, like with many technological issues. The rise of mega constellations is necessitating more international coordination. SpaceX now has nearly 1,700, that's 1,700 satellites that are on orbit. OneWeb is up to 200 satellites. Things are getting difficult, and it's going to be something we need to work at the international level to ensure that it doesn't lead to any unintended misunderstandings or miscalculations. Space is being incorporated into more national security capabilities and missions, which is potentially could lead to those space capabilities being targeted. And if so, that would have definite ripple effects to even non-military users of space. We're seeing a proliferation of counter space interests accordingly, whether it's research and development or actual operational capabilities. There have been, in terms of anti-satellite tests, there have been over 20 since 2005, which is a rate of testing that we have not seen since the early part of the space age in the early 1960s. As well, we're seeing the rise of new military space organizations. In 2019, the United States France, Japan, and India all launched military space organizations. This year alone, we've seen the United Kingdom and Australia launch military space organizations. Again, that does not indicate necessarily an interest in counter space capabilities, but does, I think, provide evidence of the importance of national security space for multiple countries and how it could affect the geopolitical discussions. Meanwhile, discussions at the multilateral level on space security and stability have been stymied for decades now, where the discussions have been focused largely on treaty or no treaty, and if they're when they have discussions at all, they focus largely on explicitly designated weapons being placed in space. There is a disconnect between the major space powers in terms of what the actual threat is to space security and stability. So that's been difficult in getting these discussions moving ahead as well. There has not, while I think a lot of space operators have a general idea of what responsible behavior is, there is no explicit international consensus in terms of what responsible and irresponsible behavior is. And therefore, when one actor acts irresponsibly, it's difficult for the national community to call them out without seeming like they're picking on them unduly. So I think the UN General Assembly Resolution 75/36 provides a good opportunity to get on the same page and have these common discussions and common understandings about what are the major threats to space security and stability, what is deemed to be responsible behavior, what is deemed to be irresponsible behavior, and how do you move this conversation forward, which we'll be hearing a lot more about in the next few minutes. So with that, I'd like to stop and give Ambassador Aidan Liddle, the British ambassador to the Conference of Disarmament Geneva, the opportunity to speak. I think he'll be talking a little bit about the content of their submission, as well as perhaps maybe the expectations for next steps and where they'd like the conversation to go from here. So with that, Ambassador Liddle, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Victoria. It's a great pleasure to be back before the Space Court Foundation, and it's a great panel you've got lined up today. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And in fact, it's been a space day for me. We've just come out of 4 hours of discussion in the conference on disarmament on its agenda item on preventing an arms race in outer space, which Letitia presented at. I got the impression, I'm getting the impression that this is an issue that's really attracting increasing attention at the moment in the disarmament and international security community. And it's rising up the political agenda. And I think that's understandable and very welcome. As Victoria noted, we see now the extraordinary reliance that all states have on space systems for their security and prosperity, and we see steadily increasing risks as well. And so it's very welcome that I'm spending so much of my time on space, because it's a very good use of disarmament negotiators' time, I think. So back in December last year, 164 UN member states voted in favour of General Assembly Resolution 75/36, which, as you know, is called Reducing Space Threats Through Norms, Rules and Principles of Responsible Behaviours. And in the process that led up to that vote, and in the months since, I've been really impressed by the level of engagement from across the UN membership, and indeed from academia and industry and civil society. It's a new process that we launched, and I think it was there was obviously a fair degree of interest, but also curiosity in what we were trying to do. But I think as we've got the message out about what it is we're trying to do and explained the background to why we're trying to do it, we've really seen an incredible degree of engagement, which is great. And we saw that at the CD earlier today as well. So it's clear to me, at least, that there's a growing recognition not only of the strategic importance of space systems to all countries, which I think wasn't really part of the conversation a couple of years ago, but also of the need for a new, inclusive, holistic approach to the old problem of preventing an arms race in outer space, which has been on the CD's agenda for about 30 years now. The resolution was primarily designed to start conversations. That's conversations within states to get governments and other stakeholders really thinking about the problems, between governments and civil society, and multilaterally between states. So conversations at different levels. The first main operational part of the resolution asks states to study the threats to space systems and to share their ideas on the further development and implementation of norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours to reduce the risks of conflict in or involving space. So that was the first level of conversation. The second main operational bit asked the UN Secretary General to compile a report based on contributions from member states on these issues and to submit it to the UN General Assembly for further discussion ahead of its next session, which starts in the autumn. The deadline for those contributions was the 3rd of May, and the response was extremely encouraging. We had about 30 contributions from states. We had contributions from the International Committee of the Red Cross and from UNIDIR, with thanks to Almudena and her colleagues. And then we also had another 6 or 7, I think it was, from NGOs, including from Raji at the ORF, and of course from the Secure World Foundation, and a few others. So it was really encouraging to have that breadth of contributions, and I think we could see both the level of interest and that this is going to be the start of a really rich conversation. As you'd expect, the UK, of course, was one of the countries that submitted its views. And I think it's worth saying that even though we initiated the resolution, we still found it a very useful exercise. We didn't have fixed views really on this going into the resolution. We knew that a new framing was needed, and we knew that a new process was needed, but we didn't have particular fixed views about what we should be putting forwards. And so it was really useful for us to have that conversation involving different parts of government and drawing on different insights and different sources of expertise. And if that was true for us, I'm sure it was true for everybody else who got involved as well. In our own submission then, we set out how space operators have to deal with a number of different challenges to operating in space. And I think it's worth sort of dwelling a little bit on that on the distinction I'm about to make. The first set of challenges relate to what we refer to as hazards, and these are generally naturally occurring in the space environment or the byproduct of space activity. So there could be things like space weather. There could be things like the particular features of the natural space domain, or there could be things like debris created by sort of normal space operations. And there's already a lot of work being done on those, most notably in the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and the long-term sustainability guidelines that were adopted recently in that forum. There's more to do, but there is certainly a process going on there, and quite a well-established track of discussions. The discussions in the UNGA First Committee on International Peace and International Security and Disarmament, and in the Conference on Disarmament, which I look after here in Geneva, are more focused on the second category of challenges, which we refer to as threats. And by that we mean actions or activities using capabilities that threaten the space systems of another state. So we're primarily talking about states as actors here rather than private operators, although obviously private operators are affected by this and certainly have a role to play in it. But we're primarily talking about state-based threats, and we are talking about actions or activities that use certain capabilities that can sort of hold at risk the space systems of another state. And these capabilities already exist. Anybody who's read the Counter Space report that Victoria and her colleagues produced will know this, but we already see capabilities such as direct ascent weapons, co-orbital weapons, directed energy weapons, electronic weapons, and cyber capabilities. These are not theoretical possibilities. These are not sort of fantasies of what might happen in the future. These are already technologies that exist, are deployed, have been demonstrated. And so our view is that calls such as those we hear in the General Assembly every so often for initiatives not to be the first to place weapons in outer space are outdated. That ship's already sailed, and there are already a wide variety of capabilities out there that threaten space systems today, which cannot be ignored. Our submission suggests that there are 7 types of activities that will particularly benefit from further expert level discussion in the multilateral system. The first is destruction of or threat to destroy a satellite. The second is use of direct ascent anti-satellite missiles. The third is non-kinetic threats such as lasers. The fourth is threats aimed at creating loss of imagery or loss of sight of space assets. Number 5 is interference with position, navigation, and timing signals from satellites. Number 6 is reducing the ability of a ground operator to control a satellite. And number 7 is rendezvous operations and proximity operations. And I think you'll see from most of those areas that while we're talking about space-based threats, those threats can obviously, each of those areas can obviously affect the operations of commercial operators as well as state operators, and have an impact on all sorts of legitimate activity. As I said at the beginning, we really don't have a fixed view on what the possible solutions to these issues are, but our submission does give 7 examples of how responsible behaviours as an approach could contribute to reducing risk in these areas. The first example is around ASAT missile testing. We think that a responsible behaviour that says that ASAT missile testing is unacceptable either in any circumstances or perhaps particularly whenever a strike leads to the creation of debris could be useful. The second example we give is to say that it's unacceptable to place a co-orbital weapon or an electronic warfare satellite next to the national security satellite of another nation. The third responsible behaviour suggested is lasing a satellite with loss of sight could be considered threatening and revealing of a nation's intent to hide activity, including preparations for conflict. The fourth is that states should not conduct or knowingly support activity, for example, the jamming or spoofing of PNT signals, which intentionally harms the systems of civilian operators, such as emergency responders or normal aircraft operations. Number 5 is that it would be unacceptable to take over maneuvering control of an active satellite without the consent of its owner. Number 6 is states should consider how best to cooperate to exchange information, set up contact lists for emergencies, assist each other, and implement other cooperative measures to address threats to space systems. Number 7 is rendezvous operations should be conducted in an open and transparent manner, include pre-maneuver communications, and follow an understood and shared set of procedures. So, as I say, these are just examples. We're not particularly wedded to any of those, or will insist on any of those, but we think they're good examples of how responsible behaviours could help. Some of them you could consider to be sort of enhanced transparency and transparency and confidence building measures, such as exchanges of information or pre-maneuver communications, that sort of thing. Others, I think, are much harder nosed, talking about behaviours around ASAT missile testing, co-orbital weapons, depriving satellites of sight or control, spoofing PNT signals, that sort of thing. And I think, again, you can already see how these would be particularly relevant in times of conflict, in times of tension, and how these sorts of behaviours can escalate tension, but also how just in peacetime these behaviours should be considered irresponsible just for the normal operation of societies. So now we and other member states have had their say. We are very keen to see the Secretary General's report, which I think is due out in August. And obviously, to a certain extent, we have to wait for his recommendations, but we do also need to start thinking now about what the further discussion of these behaviours looks like. As we've said, we've always wanted this this process to be inclusive, and that's why we started with a Secretary General's report to try and gather as many views as possible. But it also needs to be organic. It needs to be a bottom-up process. We don't have a fixed view on where this leads or the form that these sorts of understandings or measures could take. But we need to have a process that brings all of these views together, and UN member states need to work together to sort of follow the discussion to wherever it leads. I think looking sort of across the submissions, we were very encouraged, as I say, not only by the range of submissions, but also the extent to which the submissions demonstrated a growing understanding of the range of the threats, and the fact that we need to consider threats on Earth and in space holistically if we're going to prevent an arms race in outer space. But as we look forward, we also noted that many of them called for a new phase of collective work to further consolidate that understanding, and to develop this idea of what constitutes responsible, irresponsible, and threatening behaviour for space systems even further. There are, of course, norms, rules, and principles that already exist, and we think that the next phase of work could usefully consolidate understanding about those. As well as looking forward to what we need to do to develop that framework further. As we all know, the legal framework, at least in outer space, sort of stopped developing really in the early 70s, and it's clear that we need to develop that framework further. So we're going to be consulting member states very intensively over the summer to understand what their hopes for that next phase of work are. And of course, we will be presenting a new draft resolution to the UNGA First Committee in October, or just before October, to launch that, to bring that report to the attention of member states, and to launch that next phase. It goes without saying that the UK is going to remain committed to that process. Our recently published integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy, which is the government's sort of 10-year foreign policy strategy, talks in depth about the need to extend what we call the open international order to the future frontiers, including outer space and cyber, by the way, and there is an analogy to UN processes on cyber as well. I just finished, I suppose, by saying that the prevention of an arms race in outer space and the reduction of the threats to space systems that drive that arms race and imperil the security of all nations through the development of norms, rules and principles of responsible behaviours is absolutely central to what the UK's vision is all about in this area. We're really grateful to everybody who has contributed their perspectives through this process and who will do in the next phase of this work. And indeed to everyone on this call and in this panel who supported that work through their own contributions and insights, and hosting discussions like this, which I'm really looking forward to. So with that, back to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Daniel Porras, I just wanted to ask a little bit. You said you just came off the floor of discussions in the CD, and I saw there's, the discussions of Porras there. Can you just give us a sense of what trends that came in various countries, remarks there, what's the thinking on moving ahead with Porras, or at least, I'm sorry, moving ahead with space security and stability issues in the conflict disarmament? Thank you.
Yeah, it was a really interesting discussion. So I think we had about 20 states taking the floor today, and actually we didn't quite manage to get through the list of everyone who wanted to speak. So we'll have to hold some over to our next meeting next week. So we haven't quite finished the discussion. But I was really encouraged not only by the support to the responsible behaviours work, but also the level to which a lot of states who perhaps weren't the sort of main advocates of this approach are open to it, and who see it for what it is, which is a sort of new attempt to break the deadlock, really. I mean, we've been very clear throughout that this is this initiative is designed to complement, not to compete with any other issue or any other initiative. There are others out there, of course. Russia and China have proposed a treaty on the prevention of placement of weapons in outer space for many years. We and many other countries don't think that's a particularly fruitful line to take, and I can go into the reasons why later. But clearly, other states do, and we obviously respect that view. But what I was particularly encouraged by were that a lot of the states who have been traditionally open to that approach said that they were also open to trying our suggestions and to see if that could help pave the way for a legally binding instrument in the future. And that possibility is obviously explicitly held open in the resolution itself. So I was really encouraged that people are looking at this in the round. As I say, I hear much more discussion now than I did 2 or 3 years ago about the complexity of space systems, about the importance of space systems to everyday life and security and prosperity of nations. You know, this is not just a conversation about the placement of weapons in outer space, which it was 2 or 3 years ago. Now, this is a much more sophisticated, I think, discussion about what space systems are and what the threats to them are and where those threats come from. So, you know, there are of course, you know, there were 12 states who voted against our resolution, and 2 or 3 of those spoke today, and I don't think they've changed their minds. But I think it's clear that you know, the narrative now is changing, and I think it's a much better conversation as a result.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ambassador. Well, we look forward to hearing from you some more after the panelists have had their chance to have their say. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Daniel Porras, who will be my co-moderator and discussing the panelist discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Victoria. And thank you very much, Ambassador, for that excellent presentation. I have to admit, it was especially exciting for me to see prohibition on ASAT testing at the very top of that list. And also to say how exciting it is that there are substantive proposals that are being put out. They're focused, they are aimed at specific activities. We can point to them, and I think that's going to be really useful in any future discussions that we're going to be having on this. And so with that, I am also delighted to have invited a few more speakers to come along and tell us a little bit about their submissions. And the first person that I would like to introduce and hand the floor over to is a good friend, Eric Desautels. He is, and this is a mouthful, Director of the Office of Emerging Security Challenges and Defense Policy at the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance at the U.S. State Department. Eric was also the U.S. representative at the UN Group of Governmental Experts on the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space back in 2018 and 2019. So he's extremely well versed in this issue. And so I think, rightly, everybody was waiting to see what the U.S. submission was going to be all about. So with that, Eric, why don't we kick things off with you? I think you have a presentation. Letitia, can we bring that up?
Yes. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ambassador Liddle, for your introductory remarks and also for your leadership on this issue. Also, thank you to Victoria and Daniel for giving me 5 minutes to go over our 9-page submission that took months to put together and was actually the first time the United States had something on paper where we opined on what we thought would be responsible behaviors in outer space. So because of that, I've decided to completely ignore the first section of our discussion where we talked about threats from space systems to space systems, those types of issues, and instead jump into really the meat of our report, which was contained really in section 3, where we looked at 5 overarching principles, which you can read here on the list, that we thought are the overall principles that good states should be paying attention to when they're conducting their activities in space. Now, most importantly, I really don't want to talk about this, but the last part of our report, and if you go to the next slide, please, we took those norms, rules, and principles and then combined them with the behaviors we saw in section 2 and tried to map out where those behaviors, the starting points in this chart, could be lined up with areas for further consideration. And I want to say we were very clear, and as Ambassador Liddle talked about, we did not want to be very prescriptive about these are the norms everybody should be considering. We recognized that this is a very complex issue, that this is a process where we are trying to be inclusive. And so we don't know that we have all of the right answers. And that's why we wanted to say, these are some areas where we think there's a lot more work that can be done that will help us get to those norms, rules, and principles of behavior. And so, the list is very similar to many other countries. For example, I think the last one on the list there, states should consider developing best practices that enhance communications. Communications between satellite operators and between states is going to be really important. Developing definitions, and we've seen that in other submissions. I've been in meetings where the word safety and security does not necessarily translate. I've been in meetings where we've said misunderstandings, but it's been translated as no understanding. And those are two very different definitions. So having those further conversations on those issues would be very important as well. And then if you could go to the next slide, the last set of our ideas deals with a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here, limiting the purposeful debris, but recognizing that limiting debris is a very complex issue that we should have conversations on. We need to involve industry in those discussions to make sure we're not hindering their activities. But also, we are very mindful of, if we left a satellite in orbit past its on-orbit service life because it was providing essential duties and then subsequently suffered a breakup, did we intentionally create debris? So there's a lot of issues around that we wanted to talk about. You also will see in here, ideas on not using cyber means to impact the command and control of satellites, because controlling a satellite is one of the critical things that could lead to collisions in space that we want to avoid. And then obviously, the analogies to some of the maritime domain, where in sort of the incidents at sea, you have a lot of how you fly in a professional manner, how you sail in a professional manner. We should look at how you operate your satellites in a professional military manner, in a way that involves possibly not pointing your ASAT weapons or testing your ASAT weapons near another country's satellites. And so, the thing I do want to reiterate going forward is, we view this as the start of a process. I know we all would love to get to those norms right away, but this is our attempt to try to work with all of the countries that are interested on these issues. There is a lot of work that needs to be done, and we should note that it takes time to come up with these ideas. I look back at the Outer Space Treaty, and some parts of the Outer Space Treaty start in 1963 with ideas and unilateral statements that eventually lead to UN General Assembly resolutions that 4 years later show up in a treaty. So we look forward to continuing that work. That this is really good work, and we really appreciate the process that has been started that is getting us moving forward on these issues. And so that's a very, very brief summary. Very happy to answer other questions about our submissions during the questions and answers. So thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That's excellent. And I'm just going to go ahead and pop a question that I'm sure a lot of people are already wondering. But you're listing off a number of things. Are there any possibilities or any suggestions there that you listed that you've seen is kind of getting better traction than maybe it was 5 years ago or even 2 years ago when we were doing the GGE?
I think, there's a lot of work that's been going on. A lot of this is we're still learning about what's going on in space and how we're interacting. We're starting to see on-orbit servicing go up, something that we hadn't seen during the GGE. And so those issues are starting to come to the fore. And so how you operate in space in a manner that is predictable and that isn't threatening is going to be a really important area of work. Also, even understanding, what does one country view as a threat? I think the Russian submission was really interesting when they talked about military dangers that lead to military threats. And so having that conversation with countries like Russia is going to be really important. So we're all on the same page as to what sort of operations are threatening and what sort of predictable activities can we do to reduce those threats or dangers or risks.
Yeah. Okay. All of those answers are music to my and Victoria's ears. And we're really delighted to see that the U.S. is, going, pushing really hard. Not hard, I would say, but that y'all are engaging, fully engaged in the process. So
yeah, as Ambassador Liddle said, we found this a really valuable process to get our interagency together and have a conversation. I really have to thank my DoD colleagues for all of the work they put into this. The State Department is a tiny piece of the bureaucracy, and they had the heavy lifting on working with all of their components to figure out what we should submit.
Yeah, that's excellent. So thank you for all that work. So our next speaker, yet another good friend of mine, and also the firebrand that I often like to throw into conversations. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Dr. Raji Rajagopalan. She is a director for the Center of Security for Security Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. She was also my fellow in-house expert for the group of governmental experts on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. We worked quite a bit with Eric and a number of other folks on this. And Raji, I think you probably have some of the best understanding of not just space security, but also the context of space security, particularly in the Asian context. So can you please tell us a little bit about what Observer Research Foundation submission was all about, and what you're hoping to get out of this, where you're hoping to see the conversation go?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Daniel. And yeah, so when you reached out to me, you said talk about the state responses. So I'm looking more at the state responses. I would get the ORF. We submitted a submission, made a submission as well, and it was a short, straightforward few points on where we think, for instance, even as there is a urgency for more states to become parties to the Outer Space Treaty and other subsidiary agreements and conventions. I think it's equally important for states that are already parties to existing international treaties and conventions to fully live up to their commitments. So that was one of the points that we tried to highlight. Second point we tried to highlight was how the existing norms and regulations are increasingly getting diluted, and therefore the need to focus on shoring up the existing norms. And there are plenty of examples. Some of them we have provided in the submission. A third point was in terms of developing definitional clarity on key terms, and irrespective of what kind of form and shape it takes, whether it's a legal instrument or a political instrument measure, there has to be definitional clarity on concepts like space weapon, weaponization of space. Otherwise, these are being interpreted in a very expansive manner, which is not useful, especially dealing with counter space threats and so on and so forth. So let me just come to the other points that I wanted to make on the broader submissions. So I think some of the developments that find adequate mention across several submissions are, one is that about the threatening developments, including the pursuit of advanced military space programs, including ASAT capabilities and other counter space capabilities that can disrupt, deny, destroy space assets. That was one of the more or less a common theme across many submissions. Second is there's a broad call for TCBMs as an immediate measure to pursue before coming to legal measures. This, as many state submissions highlight, is due to the lack of trust among major space powers, which has become one of the biggest hurdles in developing an updated outer space regime. A third point, almost all states call for steps to prevent weaponization. A few states are still insistent on legal measures and treaties as the way forward, but willing to start with political commitments, norms, and TCBMs. Another point is a number of states identify the three-dimensional nature of threats: the ground to space, space to space, space to ground. And I think these have been identified as important while you think about a possible future measure and so on and so forth. Calls for another group, GG or open-ended working group format engagements across a number of state submissions have been found. This is important and should be pursued, but I think there is also the need for closer consultations between UN bodies like the UN COPUOS and the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. I think that's something that we made in our submission, ORF submission as well. But something that was kind of some of the submissions were quite disturbing. The entire exercise of seeking submission was an effort to build bridges, identify the space security threats in a collective fashion, and develop a common and maybe eventually reach a common shared understanding of space security threats and discuss possible ways to address them under a multilateral framework. But submission by some of the states have been unproductive, excessively defensive, and confrontational in nature. The submissions were not meant to be a political exercise, and I don't see the effort as an exclusive one, as submissions have been, as some of the submissions have suggested, because this is an inclusive exercise to the point of seeking inputs from all states and other stakeholders, including think tank and civil society members, as well as industry. The purpose of some state submissions seem to be name calling, again, which was not the idea for these national submissions. These are least helpful. The gap between the rhetoric and reality is so stark that it is very difficult to assume that progress can be made in the immediate future. It's almost like the pot calling the kettle black phenomena. While certain submissions call out actions of other states, it's almost like they have no responsibility in triggering the very same space security developments. Some of the other submissions also have made a much hue and cry about the establishment of institutions like the Space Force. It's again ironical that they do not think their own establishment of dedicated military space institutions have possibly led that way. It may not like the end result of seeing one's adversaries developing these specialized agencies, but it's a slippery slope that cannot be avoided. Let me just identify a couple of possible next steps. Some of the themes that have been repeatedly found in the submissions, but also I think useful to look at: identifying and elaborating a series of good practices, codify certain responsible behavior in the space security domain for ensuring safety, security, and predictability in space operations, as well as to avoid misperceptions, communication gaps, and to also enhance the confidence in each of the space activities. The importance of openness, transparency, and predictability have come up in a number of different submissions, but I think this is also a useful next step, at least as an interim measure before we come to legally binding measures and so on and so forth. Establishment of channels of communication between the military space agencies is absolutely critical to avoid certain misperceptions and possible accidents in space. Another common thread almost all submissions have made is that how ASATs are destabilizing, but can these states find ways to reach an agreement on ways to halt the trend with regard to ASATs? And I think that's something that needs to be debated in a much more emphatic fashion, and Ambassador Liddle also talked about it. RPOs, again, there's a general sense among submissions that but it's also quite important as far as the next steps are concerned to develop some sort of understanding among states on what RPOs really entail, what kind of measures are needed to ensure safety, security, predictability in outer space. And I believe we need to pursue all the different initiatives and proposals in parallel. It cannot be TCMs versus legal measures and so on and so forth. We need to pursue multiple tracks because the space security threats are serious at this point of time. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to chip in later during Q&A.
Roger, you're asking the UN to walk and chew gum at the same time. That might be a little too much. But just before we go to our next speaker, though, a question that I've been dying to ask you, and I'm sure a lot of folks are going to be curious. Looking at the Indian submission, any thoughts? India is clearly one of the big major space powers now. They have been developing certain counter space capabilities. What do you think their position is going to be going forward? And again, this is all speculation. You are an expert. We're asking you for your professional opinion. We're not asking you to put words in India's mouth.
Yeah, absolutely. My own sense is as to why India has obviously government has made a statement made a submission on the proposal the UK resolution. It has not really come forward in endorsing the resolution for a number of reasons, I would think. So one, I think one of the first thing is about signing on to something when countries like Russia and China are outside of this mechanism, because you are essentially binding your hands when other parties, especially in your own neighborhood, are developing counter space capabilities and engaged in serious destabilizing developments. And developments over the last one particular year in terms of broader security, military developments in the Indo-Pacific in broader terms, or even on the Sino-Indian border areas, have not been particularly reassuring of China's intent and so on and so forth. So signing on to something when you have not really developed effective capabilities to deter and so on and so forth, I think that's one particular reason. So signing on to something that especially when China and Russia, China is outside of such an arrangement is problematic. Second, I think my sense is that India is trying to see how this process is going to evolve in the coming months. And I think this is something that we have seen during the ICOC process, the International Code of Conduct. The EU ICOC process was going on in 2011-12. Initially, the Indian government was very against the idea, saying that the EU cannot determine what's good for the rest of the world. That was the approach. But from there, by the time the open-ended consultations were happening, at least India was much more an engaged player. And I was part of some of the conversations, some of these discussions that I've seen, at least was a constructive player to offering concrete suggestions at every panel, every discussion in a sense. So I think it's also waiting to see how this is going to evolve, what kind of traction it's going to have in the globally, and if this is something that India should pursue. But I think India possibly missed an opportunity to kind of see, because the very same behavior that this proposal seeks to address are some of the very same concerns that India has in terms of the kind of threats in our own neighborhood, whether it's ASATs and other counter space capabilities. Because till China developed and conducted its first ASAT test, India never bothered about these capabilities. India believed that these were all big boys' toys. But since the 2007 ASAT test, it has had a big change in India's own space orientation. So in a sense, these are the very same threats that are driving Indian space program. So India should have taken the opportunity to be much more openly endorsing the need for these norms of responsible behavior, and endorsed it with a stronger emphasis, which is not really coming through at this point of time.
Yeah, and I think that'll be really important, because as certainly you and I know, and a lot of folks are realizing, it's not that India is becoming a space power. They have been a space power for quite some time. Okay, so moving on, our last expert. Another great pleasure to introduce Ms. Almudena Azcarate Ortega. She is the new associate researcher in the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. She has taken over the space security program, and I'm delighted to know that she's there looking after a lot of the work that I did as well. And she is also a fellow Hoya from Georgetown University. So Almudena, we are delighted to have you here to introduce you to the Space Court Foundation audience and to some of our other guests. And please tell us, UNIDIR also sent in a great submission. What was some of the thinking behind it? Tell us a little bit about what went into it and what you're expecting from this process.
Hi, thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you as well to the Space Courts Foundation for having me here. I'm very happy to be part of this panel and feel very honored to be sharing it with the other panelists present today, whom I really admire. So it's great to be here. Before starting, I like to say that my comments and opinions that I share here with you today do not necessarily reflect the views of UNIDIR or the United Nations. But having said that, let me begin by highlighting that space is critical for peace and security. It's a domain that has become essential for humankind. And this is an idea that is highlighted in a lot of the submissions in one way or another. I would say in all of the submissions, in fact. At the same time, the development of counter-space capabilities creates risks to these space assets, and competition in these counter-space capabilities is nowadays at an all-time high. And this poses the question of whether we already are facing an arms race that could eventually lead to a conflict in space. And in the face of this, stakeholders have developed a collective desire for clearer rules of the road for space users' behavior. But current international law doesn't really provide those rules of the road. The OST establishes that outer space shall be used for peaceful purposes. It prohibits placing weapons of mass destruction in orbit. But beyond that, it doesn't really establish a lot of limitations on the behavior of outer space users. Furthermore, as has already been highlighted, there are many unclear concepts in space law. We have the term weapon. What is a weapon? We have due regard, dual use, which is a concept that is used a lot of times in the submissions. And all of these are interpreted differently among states, depending on factors such as their national interest or the legal traditions. So all of these ambiguities leave states with a lot of freedom of action. With more space uses and an increasingly congested outer space environment, however, the shortcomings of allowing so much freedom of action are becoming apparent. In particular, developments in counter space capabilities have contributed to escalating tensions amongst some space users. And due to the limitations of current international law, many states have become concerned about the need for clear rules of behavior of users of space from a security perspective. But political realities and the differences on powers in forums like the Conference of Disarmament over the past 40 years are not really encouraging. So this proposal by the UK to develop norms of behavior is a really welcome one, because it might stand a better chance of success in the shorter run. And these norms could help create the confidence that is needed in the process for more ambitious measures down the line, which is something that is also highlighted in several submissions. In UNIDA's submission, we highlighted 4 alternatives for discussing responsible norms of behaviour in space. First of all, a 3-vectors approach, so space to space, space to ground, and ground to space operations. Secondly, an approach that categorises threats along the lines of to and from space objects. Third, an approach that considers the impacts that counter-space capabilities can have in a more general sense, such as their effects on economic and other civilian space activities that space may want to avoid. And lastly, an approach that deals with these issues in terms of safety rather than just necessarily security. As for ways forward and what the measures themselves could look like, well, that is, I guess, yet to be seen. However, they could be grouped in the following manner into 3 distinct groups. So first of all, we could have measures that deal with communication or clarification of certain behaviours. So for example, you have states that have space assets configured with the ability to do co-orbital maneuvers, and those states, when they want to carry out these maneuvers, they could provide advance notice of these maneuvers to those states that have space objects close to them. Also regulating capabilities, for example, states that possess an anti-satellite space capabilities, or those that may seek to acquire them even, could agree to adopt test guidelines that you, Daniel, are no doubt very familiar with, such as no debris, low debris, and notification. And lastly, the third group could be enhancing understanding about the implications of new technological and other strategic developments for predictability, transparency, and stability in the space domain. So, for example, you could have strategic talks among major space powers that focus on the ramifications of counter-space capabilities for peace and security. And also states, especially nuclear-armed states, could publish their national policies on the use of their counter-space capabilities. And so to conclude, as already mentioned, given today's circumstances, identify responsible norms of behaviour for space users and strengthening these initially through voluntary confidence restoring and confidence building measures may stand a greater shot of success than we have seen to this point. So I am very excited about the discussions that we will have now, and in general the discussions and the engagement that this proposal of norms of behaviour is going to generate in the international community.
I'm sorry, it's really exciting for me to see new voices who have perspectives that seem to cut through a lot of the issues. So I'm just dying to ask now, as a fresh face, as somebody who's just coming to this for not for the first time, of course, but as someone who is now joining the discussion, what elements of the discussion and the narrative do you see that really need to be refined, and that maybe some new voices need to start stepping in and saying, hey, what about this angle, or have you looked at it from this perspective? I mean, you mentioned, for example, looking at the wider implications of counter space capabilities. That's something that we haven't really explored quite a lot up to this point.
Yes, well, let me start by saying, and this has already been mentioned, but I think it's worth mentioning again, the issue of definitions. I think that in the international community, actors tend to use certain keywords, like, for example, I use the example of dual use. And when you look at the submissions, you can see that they are used in different ways, like they have different meanings. You have states that use the word dual use when they refer to a space object that is actively used for military and civilian purposes at the same time. Like, for example, let's say GPS can be used for civilian and military purposes. But then you have other states that use the word dual use when they are referring to, for example, RPO or on-orbit servicing. So these are different things. An RPO object is not really thought out to be a military object, but could eventually be used for harmful purposes. And so this distinction is slight, but it creates sorts of misunderstandings in the debate. And I think it's important, to create a common understanding, to build first these norms, and eventually, if we might want to go towards something more permanent, it is important to have these clear definitions so that everyone is on the same page when we discuss these issues. And I feel that, when you have the same people talking about these things, that they might think, oh, I know what I'm talking about. So I think it's really good to bring new faces, to bring, not just in terms of bring, younger people that might contribute to the discussion. I think that's really important, but also more diversity in the sense of stakeholders in general. So generally this discussion of security issues is done by states, and that's great, but now you have so many more actors out there. You have the commercial industry that could provide a great input, and also you have non-spacefaring nations, at least nations that are not yet spacefaring, but which are nevertheless space users, and they are impacted by how we use space. And it is important that they have a seat at the table and that they have a say, because they are evidently going to be impacted by whatever we decide.
Absolutely. Victoria, I think you might have had a question very much along those same lines.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing, particularly hearing our colleagues in the UK and the US talk about how this resolution forced them to really sit down and think about how they wanted to approach responsible space behavior. I mean, the UK and the US have been involved in space, military space for some time. It really struck me, how do we, this is for the entire panel, how do we improve capacity building for multiple countries to really have a sophisticated analysis of space security and understanding that these space security and stability discussions affect them and that it's part of their interest? So how do we get that level of understanding and discussion points outside of maybe the more typical established space powers, but definitely space users around the world? And I'd be curious to hear what the panel thinks about that.
Shall I kick off with that one? It's a really important point, and as I said, our resolution was at least partly designed to start conversations, but also to be a sort of awareness raising tool. A lot of the way we talked about our resolution last year was in terms of helping people understand the impact of this debate on them. This isn't just anymore a sort of Cold War thing for a few states to go off into a smoke-filled room and come up with an agreement. This is something that affects everybody. And I think a lot of people, particularly in the disarmament and arms control world, didn't necessarily realize that. And so I think having a resolution like this was, partly, at least, as I say, a sort of awareness-raising educational tool. I think there's also, I mentioned before, there's a bit of an analogy to the UN cyber discussions, and I think one of the things that the cyber discussions have done really well over the last few years is to build that sort of capacity building element to it. So, I mean, lots of different initiatives have taken place, but particularly for the OEWG, which is obviously a sort of universal body. There are a lot of countries involved in the OEWG who didn't necessarily have the background in cyber diplomacy that people who participated in some of the GGEs had. And there was a really good sort of cyber capacity building program that sort of sponsored delegates who were experts to come to New York who perhaps wouldn't have been able to otherwise. The UK, for example, was really heavily involved in the Women in Cyber program, which tries to sort of get new voices involved. So there's lots I think we can learn from the cyber processes on that. But I think it's whatever the next phase looks like, and as I say, we'll be consulting on that over the summer. I really hope that sort of element of capacity building and inclusiveness is really part of it.
Eric?
If I could just, align myself with everything Ambassador Liddle said, the education piece is going to be incredibly important. We've started that process. We've submitted reports. Getting the report from the Secretary General will also be a really important part of this to help other countries understand the importance. I think that's one of the issues that is still a bit lacking, is a lot of countries are still struggling with the idea of the need for security discussions in outer space. But that's where having this conversation, explaining to them working with groups like Space Court, with Secure World to help bring that education. And I think the outreach that has been done since the submission of the resolution, all of the different NGO groups that have held panels, the UNIDIR series, the UN USA and UN ODA series are all going to be very helpful for these countries to build up their understanding so that they can contribute successfully to these discussions. Because as Ambassador Liddle talked about, this is really an open process where we want their submissions, because they're going to have interesting perspectives that are going to be very helpful for us in our deliberations as well. Thanks.
Yeah. Rachi?
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's an absolutely important point. I agree with both Ambassador and Eric and what they have to say. And I think capacity building, because there is generally a perception, even among the state submission, one could see a couple of submissions are quite wary of how this might be a way to kind of halt the emerging space powers, their ability to develop their space programs. So in a sense, especially when new initiatives and proposals are talked about, I think there is a constant need for reiterating, and particularly these kind of conversations are going to be very helpful, and especially Ambassador Liddle also to talk about as to how inclusivity and capacity building are important aspects of a new initiative that might come about, any new instrument that might take shape in the future. So the need to emphasize this is cannot be said enough, because I think that's there is quite a bit of perception issue that you need to deal with, because even when the ICOC process was on, there were a whole lot of countries, especially the developing countries, felt that this was an effort by the developed world to develop certain rules that would prohibit, that would not really let the emerging space players come up with their activities, because come up with their programs in an effective manner, because the space is already crowded and polluted and so on and so forth. So now the burden is going to be them. The other aspect that is equally important to convey to especially the emerging players is also the cost issue, in a sense. Do the new powers, the emerging space players, do they have to bear the burden of having a crowded and congested, polluted space? And again, a certain amount of reassurance need to go out from the big powers, especially those countries who are coming up with new proposal to ensure that to assure them that that's not going to be the case, and they don't have to bear the burden because it's already kind of polluted and so on and so forth. But I think the inclusivity and capacity building as two important aspects of any new initiative, and sharing of technologies, civil technologies and kind of things are not going to be restricted because a new regime is being talked about. I think that's important.
Yeah, that's a great point, Raji. And you also bring up the complexity sometimes of the dealing with safety and security issues, where a lot of countries are worried about safety issues at the moment, and so it's hard for them to get on board some of the security discussions, and maybe there's some room for give and take there between Geneva and Vienna. Melina, what about you? What do you think needs to happen? What kind of outreach are you planning?
Well, first of all, let me echo what the other panelists said, but I would also like to say that organizations like UNIDIR or the Space Corps Foundation play a really important role here, because precisely what we do is we conduct research to kind of like get to the roots of these problems, and help states make informed policy decisions, and so I think yes, it's a really important role, and I would encourage all states and non-state actors to engage with these organizations. I'm not biased at all, especially UNIDIR. So yes, we have excellent ways of engaging, like for example, UNIDIR organizes the Outer Space Security Conference every year, or for example, the Secure World Foundation puts out an excellent report on counter space capabilities. So kind of engage with these tools and kind of like just let them be a driver of the conversation.
Thanks for that. I think we all really try hard. We want to be a part of these conversations, and I know these issues are all really important to us. Before I open up the panel to questions from the audience, are there any questions for each other? Is there anything in particular that you would like to ask? No? Okay. In that case, I am going to go to the first question, and that is industry. So I'm seeing a couple of questions here that are talking about how do we bring industry into the conversation? How do we involve them as well? And I'll go ahead and open that up as well to say, how do we have the security discussion across a number of domains without, kind of sharing the problems that also come with some of our with some of these discussions? I know Kopios is often very hesitant to take up the security questions, but some of these issues, they're all cross-cutting. So what are some thoughts in terms of bringing in these different actors in a practical sense? Anyone? Eric?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that, and bringing up Kopios is a really good example. When the US delegation goes to Kopios, we actually have industry representatives on our delegation with us. So we figured out how to bring them into those conversations. And I think, one of the benefits of the approach under 7536 is that, it's not a formal treaty approach where it's just states in the room negotiating. There is room for whatever process we go forward with to get industry involved in it. If there is an OEWG or GG or whatever, you can have an industry team with you. And certainly, we look forward to having conversations with US industry in advance of any discussions as well to fully understand their positions on a lot of these issues too. Thanks.
Ambassador, what do you think? And is there any way that folks like, academia can help to bring in those stakeholders?
I think there is, yeah, and we've already seen a lot of examples of organisations sort of jumping in and starting their own conversations on the back of this, which I think is great, because the more of that, the better the ideas that generated are, I think. I mean, it's always going to be a slightly tricky one. This sort of framing of sort of the military bit over here and the civilian bit over here. On the one hand, space is a sort of very big and complicated place with lots of big and complicated things happening, and it doesn't always respect the nice, neat little boxes that the UN machinery likes to put things in. On the other hand, we do have to understand that different processes are there for a reason, and different sort of bits of government are engaged in different bits of process, and there's we have to sort of respect the distinctions that have been drawn. So it's a bit of a balance. I mean, we had a good example in the CD today where Natalie Ashina from Kopios briefed on what was going on there on the LTS process. So I'd like to see more of that sort of cross-fertilization. But equally, we have to be clear that what we're talking about here is state behaviour, and while that will have a knock-on effect to industry, and industry have to have a voice in that, as of course to academia and other parts of civil society. We're talking about primarily states as the actors that need to be sort of held responsible for their actions, and that's already sort of recognised in the framework. I mean, the Liability Convention already holds states responsible for the actions of objects launched from their territory or on their registers, even if they're not actually operated by states themselves. And of course, in some parts of the world, the distinction between the state and industry is a pretty grey one anyway. So, we have to sort of be smart enough to be open-minded about this, but equally we need to be clear on what our focus here is, and particularly when we're talking about peace and security, we're primarily talking about states as the main sort of actors, I suppose.
Raji, I know you've talked about this in the past and have received some pushback. Like how do we push back on that narrative and to have more inclusion?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be more in continuation of what Ambassador Liddle said in terms of the peace and the security elements. When you discuss security arms control issues, they are being discussed in space. It's primarily seen as a state issue, and the role of industries in that sense is somewhat limited. And I think this comes from a couple of different aspects. One is that space is a dual-use technology, and there are a huge amount of complications that come from that. Second is that there are private sector, especially in the Western contexts which are launching mixed payloads, for instance. Both civilian and military payloads are there in the same launch. So again, adding another layer of complexities. But I think to me, the most important thing, and I think why you have seen generally the Asian countries resisting the active participation of industries is because it's still seen as a Western phenomena. Industry participation is still a Western countries dominate the trend in a sense. In Asian countries, by and large, these are all space programs are led by state agencies, and therefore there is no active stakeholder in the form of industries. So when Western countries, by and large, want to bring in the industries as an active stakeholder into the rules in developing rules or having these conversations, the Asian countries have generally felt that they are at a disadvantage and don't necessarily therefore support the active participation of the industry. So that I don't know how quickly that's going to change, because there is a change in the broader trends, and even in Asia, countries like India, countries like China, for instance, has a large number of private sector players, but again, quote unquote private in terms of China's private sector space. But even then, there's a sizable number of new space industries, but also some of the larger ones that are coming up. Japan already has a fair size of industries, but again, but I don't know whether Asian countries would really embrace the notion of having industry as an active stakeholder, especially when it comes to the space security discussions and so forth. Cooperative civilian peaceful use of space, I think I think countries may still be open, but I think there's still going to be some pushback from a number of countries in Asia.
Yeah. Yeah, I will take that opportunity to plug a great Secure World Foundation publication that just came out, all about the gaps in perceptions about U.S. and or U.S. perceptions of the Chinese commercial space sector, and of course, it's very nuanced, and so it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. Victoria, I'm hogging the floor. Let me I pass it off to you. Questions?
Thank you, kind sir. Yeah, no. The thing that really struck me when I was reading through the national submissions is that, we were talking about responsible behavior and irresponsible behavior. I mean, it's not enough to name it, it's to be able to identify it and acknowledge it when it happens. And of course, that's where space situational awareness comes in as a verification mechanism. But space situational awareness is largely located within the, generally speaking, the hands of a few space actors. How do we get a comfort level with SSA data being shared across the board so that all actors can say, okay, we've had this irresponsible behavior and this SSA can confirm or deny it? How do we get to the point where there's verifying these sort of activities on orbit, whether they're responsible or irresponsible? And is this perhaps, where the commercial sector can provide a trusted alternative to national SSA information? Thoughts by the panelists?
Elena, you want to kick that one off?
Sure, why not? Well, it is a tricky question because, especially since some states have more commercial operators than others. If you use commercial SSA as the basis for verifying whether, behavior was responsible or irresponsible, some states might be more keen on dismissing the result that comes out of that SSA data. But I think that if you look at the concerns of all stakeholders, states and others, the concerns seem to be very much the same. The submissions generally acknowledge that space is important. They acknowledge the risk of space debris. They acknowledge that RPO without communication or non-consensual RPO might be kind of dodgy in a way or irresponsible. So if you look at the concerns, they tend to be the same. So I guess that tackling from that angle, instead of the different state rivalries or whether one state has some more commercial operators that could be of use in this instance than others, could be the way to go. I feel that, you know, at the end of the day, whether some states might want something more legally binding, or what other states might want something that is more normative in nature, the end goal is to keep space peaceful and sustainable. And you know, it would be my hope that approaching this from this way could encourage states and non-state actors alike to kind of like share their data. It doesn't have to be all of the data. It will never be all of the data because, you know, national security concerns, that's evident. But, you know, they might be more likely to contribute to this effort if they look at it from this perspective.
Ambassador, what do you think?
So, I mean, that point around data and SSA is obviously a really important one, and I think, you know, that this will be quite a big conversation in the next phase of it. But I think it's also worth sort of emphasising why. I mean, this is another reason why the responsible behaviours framing, I think, is quite an interesting one, because in a way, with a legally binding instrument, of course, you'd have to have, you know, pretty robust verification. You'd have to have a very good objective source of the truth. I mean, if you look at what's happening on chemical weapons, for example, you have an organization there who is, you know, trusted to be sort of impartial and technically expert, who can sort of lay out the facts, and then you have a discussion about how to enforce the prohibitions and that sort of thing. And, you know, obviously politics will out. But I think when we're talking about responsible behaviors, we're really talking again about conversations. You know, with SSA, obviously you can see how certain objects are behaving, and that's one part of it. But there are also aspects of it which don't depend on SSA, for example. I mean, you know, you don't need SSA to know whether an ASAT missile has been launched or not, particularly. There are other ways of finding that out. If you're talking about sort of things like communications or notifications about maneuvers or that sort of thing, you know, you can, that's not dependent on SSA. You can say, you know, you told me you were going to do this, or you didn't. And, you know, if you talk about things like directed energy weapons or sort of electronic warfare, that sort of thing, actually SSA probably isn't an awful lot of help in that sort of situation anyway. So, you know, a lot of this is about setting norms, which will then lead to sort of conversations. And I think with a lot of these responsible behaviours, some of it you might be able to sort of define very clearly what is and isn't acceptable. A lot of the others are going to be sort of setting norms, setting sort of bounds of acceptability or sort of expectations. And then, you know, obviously you will then expect the people affected by these things to then have conversations about it in private or in public, you know, depending on the situation. So I think SSA is an important conversation to be had, but I don't think it's the whole story. And I think responsible behaviours, the framing of responsible behaviours actually can be can sort of isn't entirely dependent on having sort of some sort of SSA gospel to read from.
Yeah. Eric, how about you? What do you think?
If I could just add on a little bit to what Ambassador Liddle was saying, you know, I think it's entirely reasonable that countries are going to want to be able to confirm behaviors. You know, and since this is the Space Court Foundation, I will say from a US government perspective, we only use the V word, verification, with legally binding agreements. So the New START Treaty we conduct verification under. When it comes to commitments, we look to confirm whether a country is meeting their commitments. So something for the lawyers in the room to talk about. But I think, you know, the discussions about commercial is really important. It's probably commercial with groups like Secure World or others to be the honest brokers. You know, yes, the US government is going to publish a lot of data through spacetrack.org, but it is probably going to be helpful if there are honest brokers who are paying attention to this. And then one other issue is many countries around the world have telescopes, whether government telescopes or through universities. And how can we get those countries to start thinking about using those tools that they already have to help contribute to this shared knowledge? Because they may be getting conjunction warnings and may want to use their own telescopes to understand what is going on, look for themselves and try to decide, is this responsible or irresponsible behavior themselves. And so getting that cooperation going, I think could be a potentially really important future part of all of this work. Thanks.
Raji, do you see any type, especially for those countries that don't have their own SSA systems? I mean, we are seeing that India is starting to develop them. There are a number of other countries that are starting to bind together into sort of regional groups that are trying to set out their own SSA systems. Do you think they're going to be willing to share information with outsiders? Do you think the current politics make it such that we'll be able to have a free-flowing exchange?
Relatively speaking, it's a non-controversial area. Relatively speaking, again, it's one of the safer areas for ideal cooperation between India or between the major space players, especially. But I think seeing from or coming to know of certain developments, I believe that even universities giving certain telescopes to be placed in certain areas for gaining a certain amount of understanding, these have run into problems with some of the space agencies in Asia. So I don't see the comfort level in sharing data seems to be a little, I wouldn't have expected that really, but I think there is a certain amount of resistance to kind of sharing data in an open fashion. But otherwise, I would have generally thought that even as the US has the largest network followed by Russia, EU, and so on and so forth, there are many countries in Asia that are beginning to develop these capabilities, as I say, India being one of the latest ones, but China has a certain amount of limited capabilities, Japan, and so on and so forth. And some of the Southeast Asian countries are beginning to do that. So I would have thought that it's an ideal area for cooperation that could also get the countries into the habit of cooperating with each other. And this is a relatively non-controversial area. But again, there seems to be some sensitivity to the kind of information. Okay, this is somebody else's, some other university is providing you with this particular telescope to be put in within your territory. But they say, no, the information we control as to who you share it with and so on and so forth. I've seen this generally with some space agencies in Asia. So I am a little skeptical that under the current geopolitical conditions, whether this would really emerge as a, but I think bilaterally, I think there are countries beginning to do that, whether it is in terms of US and India talking to each other about it. There is India talking to Australia, India talking to Japan, for instance. So there are some smaller arrangements that are slowly taking shape. India is slightly getting more comfortable with the idea of talking to other countries in terms of developing some of these capabilities, sharing some of the information, and so on and so forth. So maybe this will take in some of these bilateral arrangements could later on at a gradual, eventually coalesce into something larger, a regional kind of a framework that could emerge. But again, too early to say, but I think there could be something in the Indo-Pacific among the major space players in the Indo-Pacific that could take shape.
Victoria, you and I have also had a lot of conversations about U.S. Sharing data, in particular about certain sensitive satellites. I'm going to go ahead and just take advantage of your expertise here. Do you see this information exchange as being something that is likely, and to be able to do this in a way that will affect not just safety but security issues?
I think it definitely is a possibility. I mean, already the United States shares SSA data with all actors and operators, even shall we say, peer competitors. And so I think, there's a history of this already going on. And again, it's because of spaceflight safety needs. So if you're looking at it in terms of sharing data for a larger discussion about space security and stability, I think it's, a step beyond that. It's just a question of, I think it's important to have alternative sources and capabilities to be able to, confirm what the SSA data is sharing. And that's where, points that were made by Eric about, the countries have their own telescopes and their own capabilities, I think is an important one. One of the things that I found interesting when we do discussions internationally about SSA capabilities is that I think some space actors believe you need to have an entire infrastructure, ground stations and telescopes and radars and, this, that, and the other. And yes, of course, those are tremendous assets to have. But if you're an owner operator, you know basically where your satellites are, you have SSA data that can then be inputted and shared elsewhere. And so even a small amount of SSA data can be used to confirm or complement SSA data that you're getting from outside sources. So I think it's just more a matter of a mind shift in terms of what is needed and then being ready to share that information internationally. I think could be definitely done in pursuit of a larger goal, as Almudena said.
All right, folks, we're starting to run out of time. So Victoria, you want to ask the last question and get some final thoughts from our distinguished panelists?
Sure. Yeah, this is one of the questions that came up in the Q&A, and without getting into the whole norms versus legally binding solutions, I would just like to hear from the panel discuss, what is the power of enforcement for norms? How does a process such as this resolution with a ground up discussion, how does that build sway and authority so that there's compliance with these norms, even without the threat of a legally binding response? Anyone who wants to take that, I'd love to hear from all of you guys on this. Who's first?
Shall I start off?
Yeah, go, Raji.
Okay. I think there are a couple of things. One, I think given the current international political climate, building confidence in each other to develop an effective outer space regime that is legally binding is going to be really problematic. I don't think we have an immediate solution for that. But I think in the meantime, you need to pursue measures that would strengthen dialogue, openness, and communication, which would ensure safety, security, and predictability in outer space activities. So I think this is important. And if TCBMs are going to get you to that, I think we need to start with that. Nobody is saying that we don't need legally binding measures. We can work towards that. But I think the initial point has to be something that would help in developing greater confidence in each other. That trust issue has to be really tackled. I think that's a critical aspect. But to the point where whether TCBMs don't have any legal mandate, so what if somebody breaks a commitment, and what has really happened? Can legal measures really prove to be effective in controlling activities of states? Okay, there is no guarantee that TCBMs are going to guarantee responsible behavior, but TCBMs could also promote certain amount of peer pressure that would work in terms of if you're going to be violating commitments after signing on to something, that makes you a pariah state. But again, that could be effective, that need not be effective. I can't say with complete certainty, but looking at certain developments in other domains, whether it is in the nuclear domain and so on and so forth, even having legally binding measures have not really proven effective enough in breaking commitments. So I would not go to the extent of saying that once you have a legally binding measure in place, all your problems are gone, everything is going to be great. I don't think that is really the case. But you have to work step by step in building the confidence in each other, and that comes through a certain amount of measures. That might be TCBMs, but essentially that would develop greater confidence through dialogue, openness, information sharing, and so that it can ensure a certain amount of safety. Predictability, importantly, is required if we have to be able to secure space. And that's more important than whether it is a legal measure or a normative exercise.
Thank you, Raji. I love a clear-eyed realist opinion on these issues. Almudena, what's your take on this?
Yes, thank you. So I think the biggest, I see two. I think that legally binding mechanisms are kind of put as, something that doesn't work with norms and vice versa. So it's like they are not mutually exclusive. And in the diplomatic sphere, we seem to have like these two bands that are unable to interact with them. I think this point of view is wrong. I do think that norms are not the be all end all of all of our space security governance problems, but they do help in something that's very key, and it's building trust. I think the current geopolitical climate lacks a lot of trust, and without that trust, we cannot really discuss anything. So agreeing on norms and kind of like working towards norms could be a really helpful way to build that trust that we need. And that could eventually lead to facilitating discussions and building common understandings that eventually lead to something more permanent or something more binding. So I do see these two methods, non-binding and legally binding, as something that can be combined, and in fact should be combined. And so that is my take. Yes.
Thank you, Almudena. An important reminder that trust does not come out of nowhere. It has to be deliberately sought out and worked towards. Eric, what's your thought? What are your thoughts on this?
I just completely agree with what Raji and Amanda we're talking about. You know, what is the difference between legally binding and a non-legally binding norm that we create? They both require political commitments, and hopefully we could get countries to more quickly work through the norms issue. The thing that is important for me is, you know, we are talking about responsible behaviors that the United States will want to follow. Right? We are going to operate under these norms because we think this is the right way to show and demonstrate responsible behaviors in space. And if other countries want to join us on them, that's why we've got this inclusive process. We hope we will have countries join us in this development of these ideas, because we want to be professional and safe and secure in our actions in space and not inadvertently cause risks. But also on the other side of this is, you know, that way we better understand what we think is responsible. And if countries around us are doing things that we have defined as not responsible, then we know how we should react. We have communicated to them that these are our principles, and that helps us better formulate responses to that, including, you know, diplomatic responses, other responses, working with allies and partners, because we can articulate that. And not having any of those right now is really particularly challenging as the technology continues to move forward. And so that's where I'm really very optimistic that this process will help us start to have that conversation, start to work together with the countries that are interested on developing these norms of behavior. Thanks.
Right, this is an important part of the communication process. Ambassador Liddle, what you have last say, what would you like to end the discussion on?
Well, I mean, just on that last question, I mean, I 100% agree with everything that Raji, Amadena and Eric just said. I mean, at the end of the day, once we've sort of created a system of norms, or once we sort of go about creating a system of norms, you know, if we want to codify them at the end of the day, you know, because people find that helpful or more clear or whatever, then great. But actually, the value in it is building collectively a sense of what sort of behavior we want to hold each other to as states in the international system. And, you know, if you look back over the whole history of disarmament diplomacy, treaties that work tend to be things that codify norms that already exist. There was an expectation that we weren't going to use biological weapons anymore. And so when we came up with a biological weapons convention, that was simply enshrining something in law that we all kind of agreed that we were going to do anyway. There is a sort of categorical imperative around that. And I think as our reliance on space grows, as more actors get involved in space, you know, responsible behaviors is going to be a self-evident common good. And states who aren't part of that system are going to find themselves kind of being expected to abide by them anyway. So, you know, which kind of gets back to Raji's point earlier on, that you know, it's good to get involved now because we are creating this together. And I think it's an incredibly powerful process.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was an excellent discussion. As the space lawyer in the room, I will add, though, that setting out norms of behavior, it's not entirely without some legal implications, in particular with the liability convention. If there is a norm of behavior that someone breaches entirely, and then there's an accident, perhaps in looking at fault and the behaviors that were that created the but-for event that led to the damage, could very well be judged based on the norms of behavior that we end up setting out. So the outer space law is not without teeth.
You're absolutely right. And I should, that reminds me, I should have said actually that for the UK, actually, it doesn't really matter whether something is sort of labelled legally binding or not. If it's an international commitment that we've signed up to, we're going to abide by it, and we'll be expected to be held account for that. So actually, this kind of legally binding, non-legally binding dichotomy isn't actually that big a distinction for us, at least.
Yeah. And so I think we're starting to see some conversations coming together, and I think the narrative is getting a little bit more positive out there. And so hopefully we're going to see some progress come the fall. Folks, I think we've run out of time. We're a little bit over. It doesn't seem to have been a problem for too many folks, I hope. I just want to thank everybody, in particular Letitia. She always does such a great job of producing these webinars. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Ambassador Liddle, we always appreciate having you on. Eric, thanks for making time in your busy day. Great suit, by the way. And of course, Raji, Withena, Victoria, it's always a pleasure to get to engage with y'all. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope this was useful, and we will have the recording posted on our website as soon as possible. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Great.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye. Bye.